Greetings once again, friends, live from Retro Central. My name is Peter, and this is Consolation episode number 3. As always, I thank you very much for watching, and I hope that you'll enjoy and maybe take a little something away from what you're about to see and hear. Today's topic is about console generation comparisons. Let me give you for an example. The 5th console generation is my least favorite, or the 7th console generation is the best of all time. Making statements like that, we see it happen all the time. Message boards, social media, videos just like this one, written articles. We love making that kind of comparison because we have strong feelings about them. I can tell you that the NES is my favorite console of all time. You all know that, I'm sure. But I can't just say that, can I? I have to tell you why. I have to list some reasons that are relevant and that make sense. Let me direct you to a Screw Attack piece that I read recently that I actually got a link to that really influenced the idea for this particular video. The author's title is that the 5th console generation is his least favorite. And he goes through in the article and he makes some arguments to support his claim or his stance that, or why it's his least favorite console generation. The problem with the article, and something that I see a lot when we're talking, especially retro-related articles talking about console generations from years gone by, is that they don't always come from the right perspective. And there are some inappropriate comparisons that are made. In the article that I'm talking about, the author cites a couple of things that really don't make any sense as to why the 5th console generation, which for those that aren't sure, we're talking about the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64. He doesn't like those, and here are a couple of reasons why. One, he doesn't like loading or access times that the Sony PlayStation in specific had. Okay, I understand that. If you look back at Generation 4, which is the 16-bit generation, we were largely dealing with cartridges still. And cartridges were pretty much instant. You popped a cartridge in, you turned the power on, you pressed start, and away you went. Very few games, if any, had loading or access time that we had to deal with. So when it came time to using disc media, which the Saturn and the PlayStation did use, there was a bit of waiting that went on. Waiting when you first put the disc in and turned the power on. Sometimes you had to wait for levels or for stages to load. And that's kind of just what you did. It was a process. It was unlikable at first, I'll admit. But it is something that we got used to. And the thing that's important about making the loading time argument is the 5th console generation is not the only console generation to go through extensive periods of waiting. Generation 6, which was the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Dreamcast, Xbox era, there was load time then. There was load time in Generation 7, not to mention the added waiting time of installing some games, either to the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3. And heck, we still see it today. When I buy a brand new game off the shelf for the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox One, I have to wait. I have to wait for the game to install to the console before I can play it. And then in many cases, once the game installs and I start to play, there's a patch waiting. So I do even more waiting. Now, I can't use those examples for Generation 7 and 8 to draw a comparison to say that these are the worst console generations ever, because it's just symptomatic of what the technology is. I don't think, at least in my opinion, and perhaps you disagree, but I don't think you can hold loading time against consoles of years gone by or even of today. It's technology. To quote Bill Belichick, unfortunately, it is what it is, and we deal with it. Let's look at another complaint that the author has, which are memory cards. Okay. Generation 4, we were still on cartridges. In terms of the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, some cartridges had battery backup built in, which would hold on to our progress when we got to save points that could be written to the battery. Or, in the case of other games that didn't have battery, you'd had a password that you could enter in order to pick up kind of close to where you left off. Now, disc-based media later on, and we're talking about the Sega CD, we're talking about the 3DO, and even the Saturn, you had internal battery backup that would save progress in certain games. The problem is that there wasn't enough RAM in there to save that information, so you oftentimes had to get an extra backup cart, or you had to be pretty creative with the games you were storing. You could only play 1 or 2 games at a time before you ran out of space. The PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 got around the limitations by adding memory cards that would save information from multiple games, and you could get as many memory cards as you wanted. They were expensive back then. They're much less expensive now. But again, it was the cost of doing business, I guess you can say. The PlayStation didn't have a battery backup built into it, and there were no RAM cards, but you could get memory cards, and you could get as many as you wanted. Heck, I have probably 12 original PlayStation memory cards here that I've collected over the years, and it's just something you get used to. Memory cards stuck around. Memory cards were prevalent in the 6th generation, the PlayStation 2, GameCube generation. The Xbox, not so much, because there was a hard drive, which really started that whole train where consoles had hard drives built in or some kind of flash memory. So can you hold memory cards against the 6th console generation? Can you say that it was the worst of all time because of that? I don't think you can. So it's not really a relevant comparison. Now, one area that the author does make in terms of why he didn't like the console generation was the Nintendo 64 controller layout. He doesn't like how that feels, and that is a bit more understandable. The Nintendo 64 controller is something you're either going to like or you're going to hate, and there really isn't a lot of room in the middle for, it's kind of okay. I'm one of those weirdos that thinks that, it's okay. I like the D-pad, I like the trigger buttons, and I even like the feel of the controller, to be quite honest, but the analog stick is way too flimsy and was really since the very beginning. And then the face buttons, especially the C buttons, just felt kind of weird and difficult to get used to. I compare that a lot to the GameCube controller and how much I loathe that controller, and I do. I hate it. But that wouldn't make the GameCube the worst system of all time, or Generation 6 the worst console generation of all time. These are just part of the advantages and disadvantages that you can list for each. So when we're looking at making console generation comparisons, it's really important to do so with the proper perspective. Understanding what the technology was before and what the technology was during. Making comparisons to console generations that are 2 and 3 generations ahead just don't make any sense. We can't criticize memory card use because we have hard drives now. Hard drives just weren't a thing in consoles back in 1995 and 1996. The Saturn's battery was as close as we got. We really can't criticize loading times now because they continued for years after, at least 10 years after. And we go through it today with game installations. We've got to think, and I'm talking about all content creators, when we're talking about making comparisons within the retro gaming environment. And there are a lot of us out there that make videos just like this. It's really important to make sure we have the proper perspective when we do so. Watching video series like the Video Game Years that RetroWare and Pat the NES Punk combined to put on, they do their research in advance. And if they weren't around for those particular consoles, and some of them weren't, you kind of ask people, you ask around, you do your research, you get the proper perspective so you can go into it with two sides. I can see why people like this because I wasn't there, but I know other people like this because, or didn't like this because. That proper perspective is really important, especially because our community, the retro community, is growing, and a lot of our members are younger. A lot of the people that are collecting games now weren't alive when some of these systems were first introduced, which I think is great, because going back in time and experiencing what old guys like us experienced is a really cool thing. But if you're going to take the time to make comparison videos, to write comparison articles, to state a position, and to state arguments or evidence to back yourself up, do yourself a favor and make sure that you utilize that proper perspective and you understand what was back then and that what is now just doesn't relate, can't happen. And as to the writer of the Screw Attack piece, I can say a lot of people have called for him to be fired, which just doesn't make any sense at all. Just because he has a differing opinion from you or from me doesn't mean that anyone should be fired. Heck, anyone who's written a piece that was poorly researched, if they were all fired, there would be no writers left. Because everyone has written at least one piece like that. And even if they won't admit it, it's the truth. The best way to look at it is to just level an argument just like this. Don't call for someone to be fired. Don't call the person names. Don't get all angry. But instead, state your own position using positives and negatives. And that way we can have an open discussion and improve as we talk more about the games that we really enjoy. And that's what I'm gunning for. I hope that we can do that.